Good evening, and welcome to the series, How the Nature of Man Either Hinders or Aids Being Conformed to the Image of Christ. Now, a short recap. Last time, session 2, we looked at in detail what does it mean to be conformed to the image of Christ. And in so doing, we studied a number of New Testament scriptures that indicate very clearly that this is God's plan for us as a Christian, every Christian, actually. Now, the preeminent command, again in the New Testament, from Jesus himself in Matthew 5:48, in which he said famously, "Be perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect." Now, we can, when we hear that, we can take it a number of ways. We can say, oh, well, he was simply exaggerating. He didn't really mean what he is saying. Well, that says that he is not totally truthful. That's not the Jesus I know. Or we might take that command and say, well, that's not attainable. And he doesn't really expect anyone to really attain to it. It's just like holding a carrot in front of an animal and have them continually being driven forward with no hope of ever attaining the reward. Well, that's not my Jesus either, because that means he's simply a supernatural slave driver. And that's not the Jesus I know. So let's consider be perfect. What does that really mean? Well, in the Greek, that word teleos means simply mature or complete. So in other words, Jesus saying, be complete. Be mature, okay? Now, a good analogy of what he's trying to communicate here to us is, I think, found in a rose. Consider a rose that is in its bud state, and it begins growing from a bud to an early rose to a mature to a completely blooming rose. At every stage of that rose, we can say it is complete, it is mature, it is perfect. In a similar way, looking at our lives, we can attain to this particular command of Christ when he says, be perfect. That is, be mature, be complete. And this is what that means in the context of us being a new Christian, a Christian going along the road for a number of years, an older Christian. It applies to everyone. The command to be complete simply means that we are living totally in obedience and in conformity to all known scriptural commands that the Lord has given to us to live by, and precepts, and all conscience directives at this point in our walk. So if we're doing that, if we are not disobediently wandering here or there from what we know that the Lord would want or expect in us, and if we have nothing in our conscience that is a hindrance, that is, that we've ignored as a directive, do this, don't do that, et cetera, et cetera. At a given point in time, if our conscience is totally clear, and if we are totally in obedience to everything we know from the Lord, we are perfect. That is, we are complete we are mature at this point in our walk. Now, that can change tomorrow if we go off the road, off the rails. But the point is that we always can attain to this command of Christ with the proper humility and walking according to all the things he's shown us and all the things in our conscience that we are aware of we should be doing. Okay? Now, this session, session 3, we're going to begin to look at the nature of man. You recall from session 1, the nature of man is comprised of 3 aspects: the body, the soul, and the spirit. And of course, the soul is comprised in itself of 3 aspects, which are the intellect or mind, the will, and the emotions. Okay? So this week, we are having laid the foundation of being conformed to Christ and what the nature of man is. Then, now we're ready to take a deep dive, a look today at the first aspect of man's nature, which is the body. And in this session, we're going to be looking at the hindrance to the body being conformed to the image of Christ. So let's just jump right in. First of all, as you recall, we mentioned that sin and also iniquity is the disease that all men experience. Why? Because of the fall. Now, the symptoms of that disease in the body are summarized as the lust, plural, of the flesh. Okay, so let's take a closer look. The lust of the flesh, first of all, we need to understand that all men and women, of course, we're talking about all human beings born into the world, are inclined to one or more weaknesses, that is, iniquities, that is, propensities toward these hindrances of lust of the flesh. Okay? There are 3 major categories of lust of the flesh. The first one, sexual lust. The second one, gluttony. And the third one, sloth. Let's take a closer look at each of these lusts of the flesh that are hindrances. First of all, let's define sexual lust. Sexual lust is simply all desire for sexual satisfaction outside of marriage. Now, this is a biblical understanding of this term, not necessarily completely worldly, okay? Now, sexual lust includes 4 aspects or manifestations, if you will, in a person. It can include self-satisfaction. Well, elsewhere that's called masturbation. It can include fornication, which is sex between unmarried partners. It could be manifested as adultery, which is sex with a married partner other than your own. Or the 4th type of manifestation is lasciviousness. And if you look that up, it says something along the lines of filled with or showing sexual desire, being lewd, being lustful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So these are 4 aspects of sexual lust that are hindrances to our body. Let's move on to the second manifestation of lust of the flesh, and that is gluttony. Okay? Definition. Gluttony can be 2 different types of things. Number 1, Gluttony can be simply an excess of eating or drinking. The second type of gluttony, and these are Webster definitions, gluttony can be a greedy or excessive indulgence in anything, okay? That is, let's look at that. First of all, excess in eating and drinking. Well, that's commonly what we think of when we say the term gluttony. And it has evolved into a lot of sophisticated subtypes in the secular understanding of this term. And one of those common terms is a common misnomer, I should say, referred to is food dependency. You've heard that, I'm sure, food dependency. And it's considered a disease in these days and times. Let me read that. Food dependency is a disease typified by loss of control over the ability to stop eating certain foods. That's a food dependency. Now, I have to tell you that, of course, it's not a disease, regardless of how secular society portrays it. It is one manifestation of the lust of gluttony, the lust of the flesh, okay? And food disorders, which we've all heard and been familiar about, maybe know some people, things like there's a whole bucket full of them. There's bulimia, there's diabulimia, there's binge eating, there's food addicts, so to speak. There's other food preoccupations like preoccupation with food itself and eating, okay? To get a little bit of insight between these terms, eating disorders and food dependency, I went to a website of an organization that is deeply involved in research and rehabilitation of people like addicts that have these kinds of food disorders and dependencies. Let me just read a little bit of what they say about this. Eating disorders and food dependency. What makes them different? What is food dependency and how is it different from an eating disorder? Food dependency has yet to be acknowledged as a legitimate phenomenon. There is, however, a growing number of folks who do indeed see it as a bona fide affliction. Among these are a group of professional scientists and recovered food dependent individuals, quote unquote, themselves. One grassroots has offered the following. Food dependency is a disease typified by loss of control over the ability to stop eating certain foods. Scientifically, food dependency is a cluster of chemical dependencies on specific foods or food substances. After the ingestion of highly palatable foods, such as those containing significant amounts of flour, sugar, and highly processed foods, the brains of some people developed a physical craving for these foods. In addition, the more processed a food or substance, the greater its potential to be problematic. Over time, the progressive eating of these foods distorts a person's thinking and leads to negative consequences they do not want but cannot stop. Further, recognizing food dependency as an illness or disease is thought to be an even greater stretch. Serving as the devil's advocate are two schools of thought. First, naysayers who say substances and compulsive gambling and our behaviors are not necessary for life. Food is. They say it's not a disease. And then there's the believers, the ones that say, yes, it's a disease. And they say, yeah, but so is water and air. However, people do not consume water and air beyond their biological needs or in ways that threaten their survival. So perhaps the problem is one of semantics, disease, or fill in the blank. Okay? Now, hold that thought, and we're going to move on to the third type of lust of the flesh, and that is sloth. Okay? First, let's define sloth. It's not a term we hear a whole lot these days, but there's many references in the Bible to sloth, slothful, etc. Okay? Definition, sloth, Webster's. A disinclination to action or labor. That's the first one. A second definition is spiritual apathy and inactivity. Okay, interesting. A disinclination to action or labor, or spiritual apathy and inactivity. Interesting, huh? So there are three types of manifestations of the lust of the flesh called sloth. The first manifestation is indolence, indolence, and that is, by definition, an inclination to laziness. Okay. The second manifestation of sloth is apathy. Now, there's two aspects of apathy, both of which are defined. Apathy could be a lack of feeling or emotion. And the result of that is impassiveness. Or apathy can be a lack of interest or concern. And the result of that kind of apathy is indifference. The third type of manifestation of the lust of sloth is procrastination. Okay, now we're hearing things that start creeping a little closer to home. Okay, what's the definition of procrastination? It is to put off intentionally and habitually something that should be done. Okay, so in light of this, what we need to be able to do before the Lord in our time together is examine where we are in our walk, in our body, with respect to the lust of the flesh, be it sexual lust and any of those manifestations, be it gluttony and any of those manifestations, or be it sloth and any of those manifestations. Okay, so we introduced at the second session a rating, or let's say an evaluation scale that you and I individually can use as we progress through these next 9 weeks, body, soul, and spirit, to examine between the Lord and us, where do we stand on these different aspects? This session, we have been looking at lust of the flesh. And at the end of your segment notes, there is a little set of boxes. And in the boxes for this session is man in the image of God, the body. Okay. And the next column over has the measure of the hindrance of lust of the flesh that we've been reviewing in ourselves. And then there are 2 further columns, session 2, which is where we start, and the very last session where we will end up. Now, what we're asking you to do is look at the rating scale defined back in the second session, and I'll remind you of what those rating numbers are, and reevaluate yourself in terms of your situation, your body, lust of the flesh, and those three aspects of lust of the flesh: sexual, gluttony, and sloth, and those manifestations that can occur. And rate yourself in that column under session 2 according to this 5-point scale. Number 1, if you rate yourself a 1, then you're saying, oh boy, hindrances of lust of the flesh, regardless of what they are, rule, pretty much have their way in this aspect of my image of God. That's number 1. Number 2, if you rate yourself a 2, you can say sincerely, I see evidence of changes in this aspect of my image of God from my beginning walk until now. 3, if you rate yourself a 3, you are stating the following: I have definitely made significant changes in this aspect of my image of God from my beginning walk until now. That's a 3. If you rate yourself a 4, you're saying, I see more of Christ in me now than the old man in this aspect of my image of God from my beginning walk to now. And finally, if you rate yourself a 5, you're saying the following: I hold myself up like Paul did as an example in this aspect of my image of God. Follow me as I follow Christ. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Take some time either now or in your meditation walk to ask the Lord where he sees you in regard to being conformed to the image of Christ in your body. Okay? And with that, we're going to sign off until next time, session 4, in which we will now then be looking at the body's aid or antidote, if you will, to overcoming the lust of the flesh in whatever domain they are, so that we can be more closely, if you will, conformed to the image of Christ, being freed from these hindrances. Okay? Thank you for participating, and we will see you next time.